Welcome back to my channel for a short Leica episode which I already announced in a video I recently posted on my 5 reasons why I personally love the Leica Q2 so much. And this video here is a short time-lapse tutorial and it's about time-lapse at nighttime, so we'll see the stars rotating and we'll also look into star trails, of course. So let's kick off the video and start our little time-lapse tutorial with the Leica Q2. The first step in a night sky interval shooting for star trails is to set the camera in a manual focusing mode. And there is this switch here on the focusing ring which you have to push, then turn it, and then it's unlocked, and then you're in manual focusing mode. And most of the time you will shoot by focusing at infinity. In my case, however, I adjusted it a little bit, and we talk about aperture in a moment, because I had a pretty close foreground which I also wanted to be sharp and in focus. That's why I tweaked it a little bit, but it went reasonably well, as you will see in the sample images in a moment. The second question you have to ask yourself is, what aperture do I want to go for? And typically for Milky Way, I recommend going widest open. So f1.7 is an opportunity here on this Summilux lens, and that's what you would take in normal shooting conditions. However, as I just said, I had a pretty close foreground and nevertheless needed to have focus at infinity. So I stopped down the aperture to an f4, and that worked quite well for me for that particular constellation. After we have adjusted the lens, the next step is to go into interval shooting. And you can access this from the status screen here. So you go to drive mode, and on drive mode you go to interval shooting, but then you cannot tweak the parameters. So I recommend rather to set this up for your favorites here, and I have the drive mode here set up on my favorites page. And then I can also tweak the parameters. And I was going for 600 shots. I come back to that in a moment. And the interval I used in between the shots was 35 seconds. And I wanted to have a countdown or a self-timer of 5 seconds. Step number 3 is to set up the shooting parameters. And first of all, going for an ISO here, I have set this here on my customizable function button. Of course not for auto ISO, but I went for an ISO of 800. And with that already some of the highlights were blown out on the hotel ground here, so you will see this in a moment in the sample images, but with an ISO of 800 I could actually set the stars reasonably in scene. On metering you can decide for whatever suits you, and you can also experiment with it, but I think here multi-field actually paid back, because there was a lot of light in the foreground and then the stars in the background, and I wanted to have that light evenly distributed. I could also have gone here for, of course, highlight weighted, but then I would have to post-process this differently than I did later in Lightroom. The next step in setting up the camera concerns the shutter speed dial, and here I'm on automatic, and then we have very fast, 1/2000 seconds, and so on the shutter speed dial. And if you want to go for long exposures, you need to turn this into 1+. And then if you set up 1+ on the shutter speed dial, you actually can, with this wheel here that's set up in my case for that, I can go for long exposures. And you see this here, I decided actually for 15 seconds. So here we go. And then of course, that's the reason why in the intervalometer settings, let's quickly go there, I set up the interval between the shots to 35 seconds, because on the Leica Q2 you cannot switch off in the same way as on the Leica M11 or the Leica SL2 the automatic noise reduction for long exposures. And that means if we have 15 seconds, then another 15 seconds for the dark frame subtraction, and then I gave it another 5 seconds. And that's the reason why later in the sample images there's always a little gap between the stars in the star trails. But that's the way it is. Unfortunately at this point in time we cannot switch off the automatic noise reduction on the Leica Q2. I hope this will come in a future firmware update. And that's basically it on the settings on the camera. So here we are in manual mode. We have an aperture of f4 to summarize. We have 15-second exposure at an ISO of 800. We are in the intervalometer setting. We have multi-field metering, and that's the way to go. And we also have a self-timer of 5 seconds, which I set up here in the interval shooting parameters. And that's the way to go. And now let's look into sample images, and then let's also see how I post-process this to get star trails and a little animation how the star trails are actually processed. Here is my shooting location from my beautiful apartment on Sardinia Island in Italy, and that's the direction where basically the stars will appear later at night. And I had to go for a long shooting because in the parameters you will see later we are talking about several hours here, and that is something I had to take into account. So I wanted to be on a safe place, namely our terrace, where I was sure that no one is stealing my camera if I'm going to bed and just let the camera do its job. And I also have a pretty close foreground here with these apartments. If you see here, you will later see in the sample images even the numbers here at the doors, and that's why I also had to go for a reasonably stopped down aperture, still wider open but stopped down to some extent. We'll discuss that in a moment. And that's basically the scenery we had. We also had a lot of light pollution from the hotel ground here, and that is something which gave me an indication of the Milky Way, but not the Milky Way, as I did take photos in the past when I was in the mountains in the middle of nowhere. So that's the scene. Bear it in mind, and later when we look into sample images, you will recognize this scene at nighttime. As you saw before in the video, I wanted to have 600 frames, but when I got up next morning and the Leica did its job overnight from the terrace, I had finally 365 frames. And that is a good result, because in the technical specifications of the Leica Q2, Leica says that 350 shots is on average what you can get out of one battery load. And the Leica Q2 has no USB port, so you cannot charge it on the go. So that's the best we can do here. So let's go into the first shot here. Let's go into the develop section. And then you see here the image after post-processing. If you want to compare it with before, I pushed that button here and you see, first of all, the foreground was much more blown out in terms of highlights. So I corrected that. I also straightened the image here on lines. You see that I applied some of the perspective corrections in Lightroom. And on the night sky, you see that I accentuated the stars a lot. So here, for instance, you even see in the original frame some indication of the Milky Way based on light pollution that was not fully coming out in the way I wanted it. But it's okay. But after post-processing, it actually looks quite nice. And in general, we have crisp stars here. And I used some masking in Lightroom to get the sky in the way you see it on the right-hand side, as well as the foreground with reduced highlights and with, in general, a better look. So that's the way the post-processing played out. So going back to the single window here, all we have to do now is going into the library, and in the library getting all these images selected, and then going on export. And on export I created a dedicated folder on my desktop, Timelapse JPEG, and then I exported all the JPEGs in full quality, so 100% here, into that folder. And then we can import then into Premiere Pro and then also into StarStax, which is my software. I showed it several times on my channel to process star trails. Creating a time-lapse sequence in Premiere Pro is straightforward. We just go to import here. And then I had this dedicated folder where I exported all the frames from Lightroom into. I made sure in Lightroom when I exported it that I have them numbered in a correct way and that Premiere Pro can really create that sequence as a clip. And then we only select the first frame. That's important. Don't select them all, and go into options here and make sure that image sequence is checkboxed. Then we import this, and when we imported it, we can move it into the timeline. We can zoom into the clip a little bit, and then we can play it. And then you already see here in the preview window the animation of the night sky rotating around that position where I was standing on the terrace before to take the frames. The software I use for creating star trails is StarStack, and I've showed this several times on my channel. You can download this for free. I think a donation to the author who provides this to us without any charges would also be nice. You find all the details on the website. And here I can import now my frames, which I just also imported into Premiere Pro. So I select them all and I import them into StarStax. Then we can close this folder here. So here are the frames. You see them here in the right sequence of the way we numbered them. And then I can fill in some parameters here. I typically choose gap filling. Comet mode is nice. Longer trails. Because we have that gaps between the stars. You remember what I said before. I have 35 seconds in the intervalometer. Because 15-second exposure plus 15 seconds dark frame subtraction plus 5 seconds of headroom. So the images can be stored. And that creates gaps between the stars, and we can fill this to some extent here in the software. I also want to have saving after each step, and I will choose a folder for that. And the folder I want to have is here. I want to use here Star Trail Frames. That's the folder I want to use. So let's open that. Starting this numbering of the saving after each step with 0 is fine. Let's see what we have here. Automatic interpolation is fine. We don't touch anything here. No compression. And we can start to process this. So I push a button here, and then you will see how the software on the left-hand side is going through the frames and adding them in consecutive ways. And you see already star trails here, a little bit indicated in the image and the animation. And that is basically all we have to do to create the star trails. Let's give it some time to get the work done and process these 365 frames. Since in StarStack before we made sure that every single step of progress is stored as a separate frame in a separate folder, we can also import these frames now here. So we go again to import, and then we have to choose a different folder. Let me see where it is. So I think here we have star trail frames. Exactly. So let's import them in the same way as before. Pick the first frame, make sure image sequence is checkboxed here, and then import that as a clip. And now we can get it into the timeline and compile this all together to a final time lapse, which I'm going to show in a moment. But before that, let's also get an ending for the first clip where the stars are just rotating. So let's get dip to black in here. Let's zoom in a little bit. Let's make this a bit shorter. Let's get the other clip with the star trails here. Let's also dip to black here at the end. Let's also make it a bit shorter. And then we are good to go. And if I play this now, let's just go in here. You see in the preview window how the animation is playing out and the star trails are progressing. And then we also have to look quickly into the final image, which I will do in a moment. For the time being, I export that clip, and then we have our final time-lapse result. I also imported the final stacked frame where all these 365 frames are stacked on top of each other into Lightroom again and tweaked it a bit in the settings here, but nothing dramatic. But if you look at the final result and we crop into 100%, you see here so many details on these little houses here. So here, for instance, is number 404. Here is number 405. And so on. And I think this is a really good frame. The star trails are accentuated now in here, and we have basically achieved our target and our goal we had in that little project.
That's it, and that's all I wanted to share. And if you ask yourself after many videos where I said I don't use shoulder straps, look into my 5 reasons why I love the Leica Q2 and why here on Sardinia Island in Italy I actually had a shoulder strap on my Leica Q2. If you liked that video, don't forget to drop me a thumbs up. Stay tuned on my channel, there is always more to come. Thanks for watching, stay safe and healthy, and of course, peace out.